Hello, I'm Ramesh Bushal. Welcome to the webinar. I work with Internews Earth Journalism Network as a South Asia content coordinator, and I'm also associated as Nepal editor for the South Asian online called the thirdpole.net. So today we will be talking about the food, agriculture, climate change with two of our experts who work with CGIAR network and are based in Vietnam. So I would I would say we will have a session where we will be cool. So this is a webinar focused for journalists from Asia, and we will be doing this for 1.5 hours. And I would like to welcome our two panelists, Leocadio Sebastian. Hello, Leo.
Yes, hello.
He's based in Vietnam. And we have Godfrey Grosjeson. Hi, Godfrey. Hello. So both of them are based in Vietnam and work intensively on agriculture across Asia and have been involved for long. And so we'll be talking more about the agriculture, food systems in Asia, how climate change is impacting on those agriculture systems, and what is the future. So we have designed it in a way that it will be easier for us to really go through. So we will be tackling basically 4 questions around agriculture and climate change today. So the first question we would like to deal with is, what is the problem with the current agriculture systems and how to tackle the impact of climate change? And the second question we will be talking more about is, where is the agroscience heading and what does the climate smart agriculture mean and how does it look like on the ground? The third question we would like to have and talk more about is how a good climate policy can help to feed the rapidly growing population in Asia in a sustainable way. Are there any good examples of how the good agroclimate policy in this region has worked? And we all know, most of us all know that there was a climate change conference in Katowice, Poland in November, and there are a lot of things going on around. So what is the clear message that the Katowice Climate Change Conference, which we call COP, that was held in Poland, and what is the way forward for Asia? So we will be dealing with these 4 questions around, and we will give around 20 minutes to each of our panelists, and then we will have a question and answer session where we will have questions from our participants. So all of our participants, please feel free to write your questions and ask out to our panelists whenever needed, or if you want to interrupt in between, if you don't understand anything and want to talk about it, please do so. But if you have a question, then please note your question, and we will have a Q&A session where you can ask questions, or even if you have views or anything that you would like to share, please go with it. So without delaying, I would also like to introduce Amy Shim, who is with us, is based in Bangkok and work with Internews Earth Journalism Network's Asia program as manager. And I would like to start with Leo. Leo is based in Vietnam, Hanoi, and he will have a presentation at the first, and then we will go to Godfrey. Please, Leo, it's your turn. Hello, Leo.
Hello.
Yes, Leo,
Hi.
can you hear us?
Yes, but we dropped off somehow. Let's hope it doesn't happen again.
How about
Okay,
the
yeah,
other?
please.
You have
Please go with your presentation. We can hear you now.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. Okay. Is it? Can you see our slide? Can you see it, Ramesh?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So let me start. So good afternoon to everyone. I will try to first tackle the first two questions, and then Gudfra will try to tackle the two other questions. But let me first introduce what we are doing in CCEP. So I belong to CCEP Southeast Asia, and the target countries that we are working on are Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia. So basically our work is focused on integrating CCEP's work in national programs and integrating CSA in national policies and development plans. So that's the focus of our work in Southeast Asia. And I would like to acknowledge also our donors. Where is it? How do you move this one? So we have donors from CGIR, UK8, and the others. CCEP is actually a big CGIR program, and in Southeast Asia, it involves IRI, CIAT, World Agroforestry, ILRI, C4, SIP, ICRISAT, IMI, World Peace, IFRI, and Biodiversity. So there are 11 centers that are working together in Southeast Asia and South Asia also. So we work actually in many areas. Some example of these activities that we do are listed here. Now we go to the first question. What are the first question that you have? What are the main problems with our current agriculture system? So looking at it from the climate change perspective, in addition to what we always hear that in Southeast Asia, the temperature is going up in most places, and the rainfall is also going up in other places, although when it comes to rainfall, there's a lot of variability or uncertainties. There are things that are that are known or fixed in many places in Southeast Asia, and that is the vulnerability of certain places. So most common among the vulnerability among the natural calamities are floods, droughts, sea level rise, landslide, and cyclones. And here you can see the figure showing different colors, multiple climate hazard index. So you can see different places that have different levels of hazards. And if you try to be more specific, there are really specific hotspots, we call them climate hazard hotspots or dominant hazards. So there are places in Southeast Asia where you know that they are prone to droughts, they are prone to cyclone, to droughts, to sea level rise, to droughts and floods, to landslides, to droughts, then droughts multiple. So different kinds of climate hazards. And besides that, we also know that in Southeast Asia, there are countries or the economies in Southeast Asia are very competitive when it comes to agriculture. There's a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that are exporting agricultural products. And the current thrust or challenge is how to improve their competitiveness. Then there's also the challenge of sustaining food and nutrition security in many countries at the national and regional level. Then you have the ones that I've shown you a while ago, the coping, the challenge of coping with climate change like El Nino or extreme weather. And starting in 2015, we probably all know that we now have also the ASEAN integration, regional integration. So it is not just climate change that we have to address. We have to look at also this future direction that Southeast Asia is going in the coming years. That's why in our work, we always try to work with the national partners, working with them in terms of agricultural restructuring plans, national adaptation plans, in AMAS, their investment on the NDC and climate adaptation, and we are also working with them on risk and area-based adaptation plans. So what are the potential solutions from the agroscience perspective? So from CCEP's perspective, the way we view or try to address the different challenges in Southeast Asia is using this framework. So here we try to attack the problem from a landscape perspective. That means we look at the major food production areas in Southeast Asia or even in South Asia. We have and we know that the major food production areas are the mega deltas, and from there we look at how we can integrate the different climate smart practices, technologies and practices that can address the climate challenges and at the same time improve the productivity, sustainability, and resilience in those areas. But to make any climate smart agriculture practice, you have to properly integrate it also with your early warning system and the climate risk that we have identified earlier. So I will go to a more specific example in a while, but I'm just giving you the overview of how we attack the problems in Southeast Asia. So here, CCEP is working on different flagships. We have 4 flagship programs, 4 flagship areas like policies, climate smart technologies and practices, low emission development, and climate services and safety nets, plus a cross-cutting team on gender and social inclusion. And these are just the list of flagship projects that we are implementing together with the different centers. Now, more specific, what does climate smart agriculture mean and how does it look like at the ground level? To make climate smart agriculture work at the ground level, the way we do it is that we work first at the village level. So in Southeast Asia, and this is also true in South Asia, for those who are in India and Nepal, we have the so-called climate smart village. So in Southeast Asia, we have established 7 climate smart villages where we evaluate different climate smart practices, and we also work with the community to help them build the capacity to decide on what climate smart practices and technologies is appropriate with the specific climate challenge that they have. So for example, in Laos, the main challenge in the climate smart villages in Laos is the drought and climate variability. Whereas in Cambodia, they have the climate challenge of flooding and also climate variability. In Vietnam, we have a village, for example, in the north, they have the problem of cold spells and sometimes flooding. And in the Mekong area, in the southern Vietnam, they also have different climate challenges. So in these climate smart villages, we work with community in a participatory way and try to see how they can, what are their constraints when it comes to adapting a technology and at the same time upscaling the climate smart technologies that they think will be appropriate to help them cope up with the climate challenge. And this is, and for the past 5 years that we've been working on climate smart villages in Southeast Asia, we have developed the steps on how we can upscale climate smart village. And these are the 8 steps that we have worked out with our partners. So at the national level, we are now actually ready to upscale climate smart village as a national program. We are doing this already in the Philippines through the AMIA program, where AMIA has already established about 17 climate smart. They call it AMIA villages, but it's a pattern after the climate smart village concept. And there are also now climate smart villages being established in Myanmar, and very soon the Vietnamese government is also thinking of upscaling climate smart village concept in their new rural development program. Now, to be more specific, how can we use, how do we do this, the upscaling of climate smart agriculture practices? I will cite you a simple or a more specific example. And this is how we are working with the Vietnamese government, specifically the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, in trying to address the multiple climate-related risks in the Mekong Delta. So as you may be aware, the Mekong Delta is the biggest rice-producing area in Vietnam, producing about 55% of the rice in Vietnam, 90% of the exported rice in Vietnam, and covers about 4 million hectares harvested area every year. So it's a big area, and it has a very big implication when it comes to food supply in the region, not only in Vietnam, but also Southeast Asia and even globally, because they export about 5 million metric tons of rice every year. So last 2016, the area was affected by El Nino, and the Vietnamese government was asking what can be done to cope with the future shocks of El Nino, because at that time we thought that there were many things that were not happening. Warnings were not translated into agricultural advisories, although there are many things that can be done. They were always late. The announcements were late. So, for example, there was a saline intrusion. There was an announcement to plant saline-tolerant rice, but there were no seeds. So it's just like now, there's El Nino, there are some countries saying you should plant drought-tolerant varieties, but who produced the seeds? Somebody has to produce the thousands of tons of seeds that are needed before the El Nino. So it requires at least a year for preparation. The impact of climate hazard are specific. So usually the announcement will be for the whole country, but you have to be very specific because not the whole country is totally affected. Then there is also weak communication among government agencies in responding to the hazard. So we did this assessment together with the different centers, and we submitted this to the government of Vietnam. And these are the things that we tried to recommend that should be done. Localize risks and impacts, identify practical adaptive solutions, develop adaptation plans and scenarios. And what we did is that we developed a simple scheme, which we call climate smart map, or the climate smart map, or climate risk-related maps and adaptation plans. It's a way of simplifying all the technical knowledge that we have so that it will work on the ground. And we did this by bringing the different technical knowledge on the risk or the adaptation activities, etc., and working with the stakeholders. So we work with MARD, the Department of Crop Production, and also with the provincial agriculture offices and the local extension workers. And we came out with simple but very specific maps that can help them cope with either saline intrusion or flooding. And here you can see, for example, the map of the rice-based system in 2010. Then you have the normal year. We have developed a simple map, again, during normal year, and then under severe year during El Nino. So, for example, during normal year, like last year, this could be a recommended crop-based system. And during severe year or El Nino, they can shift to another type of a crop-based system. This is another example of the map. So you can see normal year. What we did is we developed a map that indicates red, yellow, and green. So in the red areas, it means don't plant rice. It's really risky. In the orange or yellow, it means be careful. And if it is green, it means go. You can plant. So this is how we develop the map. Because sometimes when we see this risk map, they're not very clear. You give it to the extension worker, they cannot apply because they do not know where is the red, where is the yellow. Here, if you are in the red, these are the measures you can do. If you are in the yellow, these are the measures you will do. If you are in green, you are safe. So we develop the risk map, and then what is the cropping pattern that is recommended. So we did this for each specific provinces, in the 13 provinces in the Mekong River Delta. And this is how it looks like if you are looking at the simulation model or the ones that we usually see. And below is what the CS map would look like for the Mekong Delta. So you can see that the map is very specific. Now,
Yes, Leo, I'll just reminding you time. We have 2 minutes more for you, so please.
So it's almost done. So this is now a example of how it was applied by the different provinces and by MARC. So this is the planting calendar in the Mekong Delta. This is the usual calendar, the gray one, if you see. So there are 3 croppings, but using the risk map that we developed, they were able to adjust it to the green one. So now they can avoid salinity during the dry season. They can also avoid some of the flooding during the wet season. And then the other side, you can see the risk maps that we developed. We have the high risk, the medium risk, the low risk, and the not affected areas. So now this is now being upscaled in the different provinces. So we have planting calendar using the risk map again. The MARC, Ministry of Agriculture, and the provincial agriculture offices are now developing planting calendars for different maps using the risk map as their guide. So the CS map that we have developed is now also being used to develop risk for crop insurance, for other purposes, as you can see. So we are trying to build up on this risk. So this is an example of how we have been able to work to make climate smart agriculture work at a large scale in a specific area that I mentioned a while ago in our framework. So this is just an example, and we are now trying to see how we can also apply this in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Wonderful. It's nice to learn more about this kind of systems that you have put in place, and I think that will be helpful to understand the real the threats and also act accordingly. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I will go to the Q&A later. But definitely, there are a few questions that our participants have asked us. So we will address those questions once we start from the Q&A in about 20 minutes from now. But there was one question that was quick from our friend Miran. As the question is, how did you select community level champions to adopt that approach, and who have usually taken leadership position to help realize the program on the ground? So if Godfrey can answer that question if now, or Leo can do it later, but I just wanted to remind that there is a question from our friend in the network. But Leo, you can start your presentation, and if you think it is a question that you can answer, then feel free to answer as well. And there are a few other questions that our participants have asked us. Definitely, we will we address those questions as well. Godfrey, please, it's your floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ramesh. So regarding Miran's question, I suggest Leo maybe respond to it just afterwards when we have the discussions, because it was related to his presentation. So let me just introduce myself briefly. My name is Godfrey Grosjean. I'm from the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CCEP, in working in the regional office for Asia, as you mentioned before. So my work focusing on climate policy, basically supporting the implementation of climate policies in the agriculture sector. So we work in Southeast Asia, but also in South Asia and Central Asia. And we contribute obviously a lot to the work that CCEP is doing. So we're part of the CCEP program, as Leo mentioned. So I was asked to focus more on the last two questions that Ramesh presented earlier. I don't know if you can put them back, Ramesh, on the screen, but maybe it's good for the participants to be reminded about the questions. Leo focused on the first two. What is the problem with the current agriculture system and how to tackle the impacts of climate change? And Leo really nicely presented the sort of vulnerability of the agriculture sector. But there is another aspect that I would like to bring up in terms of what is the real challenge that related to climate change in the agriculture sector. From my point of view, it's also that unlike other sectors, perhaps, the agriculture is both victim of climate change and at the same time culprit of climate change. So we all know that a lot of the poor globally somehow are working in the agriculture sector. In fact, 75% of the world poor have activities or professional activities that relate to the agriculture sector. And at the same time, if you look at the agriculture sector and also land use change, which is often related to agriculture, you see that the sector emits about 25% of all emissions globally, directly or indirectly. So it's about a quarter of all emissions globally, greenhouse gas emissions that come from the agriculture sector. So that's a bit setting the scene, and at the same time, so that's the situation we're facing. But the sector is also facing important challenges in the future. The first one is that we still have a growing population globally, and in order to respond to this growing population in terms of food supply, we have to increase by 2050 the calories we produce globally by about 50%. And at the same time, in the next few decades, if you want to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement, and I will come back to that in a second, if you want to basically stabilize global warming globally, we have to reduce emissions by about 50%. So in the agriculture sector. So that means that we have to increase productivity, produce more, but with a lot less emissions. And so that's the situation that we are facing, but at the same time, the sector itself is highly complex. It's quite different from the energy sector, where you have usually few large companies that have good access to capital, that have good human capital. In agriculture, we're facing a sector where we have millions of smallholder farmers that don't have access to capital, access to finance. They don't have necessarily access to information, and they are highly vulnerable. So it's quite challenging as a sector to tackle and to implement sort of policies that massively change the sector. I believe there are solutions, and we will touch upon this, but it's certainly one of the tough sectors to tackle when it comes to climate policy. So that was related to question one, to complement what Leo said. Now, in terms of climate smart agriculture and what it is, and Leo nicely presented the work we're doing on CSA. I just would like to give a bit more to complement to what Leo said on CSA. So I think first it's important to remind what is really CSA, because I'm not sure everyone here knows what is the concept of climate smart agriculture. So the whole idea of CSA is really to find or prioritize agricultural practices and technologies that have synergies by increasing productivity for the farmer, increasing resilience of the farmer to climate change impact, and reducing emissions whenever it's possible. So it's really to try to find triple wins practices. So in a way, like people call it climate smart agriculture, and that's a term that was coined. Others, I heard farmers saying just it's actually common sense agriculture in a way. So it's finding good practices that benefit the farmers, but that have at the same time a positive impact on the environment. Now, this sort of concept is somewhat abstract for some people, and there has been a lot of discussion what is actually CSA. And here I just would like to point out to a study that we finalized last year and that we presented at the COP, so in Katowice, together with the World Bank, so it was a joint effort, which synthesized the results from CSA country profiles that we did in about 30 countries. So together with the World Bank and other FAO and other partners, we did those country profiles for about 30 countries where we look at the status of CSA in the countries, and together with local experts and national experts, we prioritize potential solutions in terms of CSA practices in the country. So through that process, we interviewed or we worked with about 1,500 experts globally. And then based on this amount of information, we tried to come up with a synthesis and a general trend of what CSA looks like around the globe. So on one hand, you see that CSA is highly diversified. So across those 30 countries, the experts prioritize about 1,700 practices, different practices across all production systems. So very diversified practices, but at the same time, what we see is a strong convergence in terms of what CSA actually is. So we have a lot of different practices that were selected, but about 50% of all the practices that were selected by experts globally fall into 5 categories. The first one is water management. The second one is intercropping. The third one was developing improved varieties and crops that are tolerant to stress, so to stress also related to climate change. The fourth category was organic inputs, and finally, conservation agriculture. So where you minimize the soil disturbance, you keep crop residues, and so to have that has an impact in terms of adaptation. It makes the system more resilient to climate change. And it also allows sequestering carbon, so it has an impact on mitigation. So on one hand, CSA is diversified, but we see a sort of convergence in what people focus on or decide to select as sort of the low-hanging fruits in terms of good practices in the sector. So that's one, so CSA is one aspect. The other one is really where we see developments, it's digital agriculture, big data, remote sensing, and Leo mentioned that. So there is now a lot more opportunities through technologies to basically provide customized agricultural advisory to farmers. Now, one of the issues there is, of course, this question is, are those high-tech solutions accessible to the most vulnerable farmers, or how can we make them accessible to the most vulnerable farmers? And that's, of course, requires also policy intervention and sort of a very active stance from the different stakeholders. So those were just a few points to complement the discussions on the question 1 and 2. Now I want to move to the question 3, which was how a good climate policy can help feed the rapidly growing population in Asia in a sustainable way. So based on the challenges that we faced in the agriculture sector, and I was outlining that just a few minutes ago, if we really want to respond to those the challenges that are in front of us, from my point of view, we need a policy shock in the agriculture sector. So there is no more time for complacency. We really have to implement a lot more to change, to transform our food system so that we are able to respond to those challenges. And from that point of view, we need to have policies on the supply side and also policies on the demand side. And I will explain what I mean by that. So on the supply side, it means basically policies and interventions that help improving our production of food. So one aspect is, of course, reducing yield gap. So there are still much lower yield in some countries than others. By improving extension services, providing improved inputs, we can reduce those yield gaps and increase productivity in the agriculture sector. That's one aspect. The other aspect on supply side is really improving access to finance. So globally, we see that there is a lack of finance of about 150 billion each year for the agriculture sector. So there is not enough of funding going to the agriculture sector to respond to the investment that would be necessary to increase productivity and also to respond to climate change. So how do we do that? What are the solutions to mobilize more funding for the agriculture sector and more finance? So one aspect is really to develop new investments, vehicles, and instruments. So I just will give one example, but this week, IFAD, together with the European Commission and the government of Luxembourg and other organizations, launch a new fund for the agriculture sector, which is called APC Fund. And it's a fund that will really target financing for the missing middle. The missing middle is all the cooperatives, SMEs, rural SMEs and so on that often have difficulties accessing finance. So farmers, often there are programs for them, still though they don't always manage to access finance. And then more downstream in the supply chain, you have larger actors that usually have less problems accessing finance, but this missing middle is often an issue. And it's very important also they play an important role in being able to transform the agricultural system, because they're closer to the farmers and they link to national and international markets. So they will develop this first loss capital fund that will leverage. So it's a fund of 50 million, and the idea is to leverage an additional 200 million from the private sector. So that's one aspect, new investment vehicles. We need to de-risk finance in agriculture. One way to do so is to provide insurance products, as you mentioned, for farmers. And we see that at the moment, agricultural insurance is available for less than 15% of farmers globally, or at least in developing countries. So if you give them insurance, that means that whenever there is like crop failure, for instance, or climate impacts that affects the revenues, the insurance can make up for, at least partially, for the loss for the farmers. And that makes make the farmer better able to pay back potential loans that they would have taken to invest. So for the farmers, it reduces the risk, but also for the financial institutions. So de-risking finance. The other aspect related to improve access to finance, from my point of view, it's related to smart subsidies. So there was recently an OECD report that shows that more than $500 billion USD go every year as subsidy in the agriculture sector. Either subsidies to input, price support, direct payments that are not linked to outputs. But very little of that amount of money goes actually into specifically supporting climate smart agriculture. So if we have all this money available, we could perhaps rechannel it so that it can increase the funding for climate smart agriculture. And then we need to, on the supply side, also unlock policies and regulatory constraints that reduce access to finance. A typical example is land rights. So farmers don't have clear land rights, they don't have collaterals, they don't have access to finance. So that's one way also clarifying that to improve or ease the access to finance for farmers. On the supply side, again, I think that we need to take more of a supply chain approach. So I talked a lot about the farm level intervention, but there is, as many of you know, there are a lot of food loss and waste throughout the supply chain. So about a quarter of all calories that are produced in the agriculture sector are just lost or wasted. So if we can manage to reduce that, we also will manage to increase productivity and to make it easier to to respond to a growing population and to reduce the amount of land we need for agriculture. Now, on the demand side,
we have a few minutes, couple of minutes for you to wrap up. So please.
So yeah, let me quickly finish my points. So on the demand side, there has been recently a lot of discussion on meat consumption. One aspect is livestock has put pressure on forests and also emits a lot of emissions. And we see with the growing middle class an increasing consumption of meat. So I think from that point of view, there are questions of how we can avoid overconsumption of meat, especially, I'm not talking about most vulnerable people, but the well-off part of society. And so by providing information about the implications, for instance, in terms of health, in terms of the environment, but as an economist also, I believe in price signals. And I think if we really want to, if we're serious about the Paris Agreement and the implication it has in terms of reducing emissions, it's a question that we need to start putting on the table, how we can use perhaps price signals, carbon pricing to have an impact on sort of emission-intensive food. So in terms of the success stories, I think there is, I will not go into a lot of details or a lot of examples. I think, unfortunately, from my point of view, there is not a landmark climate policy in agriculture like you have in the energy sector, on the industry with like emission trading systems. So those are really policies that have changed. For instance, in the European Union, in the energy sector or industry, this didn't happen. The climate policy has lagged behind, generally speaking, in the agriculture sector. But we see new initiatives that are really interesting. One, for instance, is the India agroforestry policy that was launched, I think, in 2014. And that foresees an increase in agroforestry to reach about 33% of all agricultural land. And there they really try to remove barriers to agroforestry scaling. So reduce restriction to transport of agroforestry product, improve access to finance, improve extension services. So there has been sort of interesting development. I don't know how successful it has been in terms of the implementation yet, but I think in terms of the signal and the policy itself, it's certainly an interesting story to look at. Now, finally, and I will be quick on this, you asked about Katowice, what were the sort of outcome of the COP in Poland. I see three key outcomes. First, so what came out of this, of the Katowice conference was a rule book on the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So basically, the whole idea was to define clear rules, having more transparency and clarity on monitoring, reporting of that would be done by the countries when they implement, through the implementation of the Paris Agreement. They also discuss how the global stocktake, where countries will have to report every 2 years from 2024, will take place and the modalities related to that. There was one contentious issue in that related to the rule book, was related to carbon credits. There was discussions about which country could take into account carbon credits, for instance, from avoiding deforestation when they sell it to other countries or to other partners abroad, because we want to avoid double counting. So, and I think this still needs, there was discussion on this and it still hasn't been clarified totally. So I think next year they will try to have more clear rule on that. Well, so we improved and we made progress in terms of rules. That was a positive outcome in Katowice, but we didn't really improve when it comes to the ambition. And that was, there was a lot of expectation that was created before Katowice by the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees that really clearly sends warning about the implication of global warming, saying that the impacts will be worse than expected and we should try to stabilize global warming below 1.5 degrees to avoid some of the largest risks, not avoid, but reduce some of the largest risks. But that has implication that we need to basically globally reduce emission by 2 by 2030. So we have less than 15 years to cut our emissions by 50%. So it requires really action. Now, there were hopes that the parties would take on board the conclusion of the report, but that was not the case. They welcomed the completion. There was sort of word twist and play around words in the final outcomes, but basically the parties welcomed the completion of the report, but didn't endorse really the conclusions. On climate, and finally on climate finance, we have seen new moves. So Germany committed more funding to the Green Climate Fund as part of the commitment of developed countries to support most vulnerable countries. And we also saw that the World Bank has committed more than 200 billion over 5 years specifically for climate change. So there was the positive development, but unfortunately, in terms of really raising the ambition, this didn't happen. So
yeah.
I'm here for the moment, and I look forward to the next discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Godfrey. There are a lot of information, and there are many questions that our friends have asked on the text as well. And I would like to also encourage you to speak. You can just raise your hand if you want to speak or ask question, and specifically ask question to two of our panelists. So feel free to ask questions. Now we will open the floor for questions. But before going to that, I would like to just point out a few questions that were sent to us, and then we will start with those questions, and I urge and I encourage our participants to open the mic and ask questions. So there are a few questions in our platform. Let's go one by one, basically. There's one short question from Miran Sanchez, and how much of the total agricultural contribution to GHGs actually can be attributed to Southeast Asia? So is there any fact, like a quick answer to that question, Godfrey or Leo? And then we'll move to other questions.
Do you have an estimate?
I don't have an estimate on the top of my head that we can easily check and come back to Miran. That's no problem.
Yeah.
But I think what we can point out is that a lot of the economies in Southeast Asia, of the countries in Southeast Asia, have a lot of emissions coming from the agriculture sector compared to, let's say, developed countries. So I think in Vietnam or other countries in the region, like 30 to 40% of emissions can come from the agriculture sector. So proportionally, here in the region, there are more emissions coming from the agriculture sector than from, let's say, OECD countries or so. So it's certainly important share of the emissions come from here.
Thank you.
Agriculture sector, but the exact numbers, I don't have it on the top of my head.
Well, we can hear once we get those information to Miran. And another one quick question is, can you please send us the link to the EU fund that you talked about? It is possible to send the link where the more detailed.
So I can send the link, but the name is very easy. It's called ABC Fund. And as I said, it's supported by EU, the government of Luxembourg, IFAD, and others. But I can send the link.
Cool. Thank you for that. Those were quick questions asked by our participants in this webinar. We have more questions. I would like to go to other questions. Basically, there was a question that I asked earlier to Leo. If you have noted down that question, could you please answer that question about how do you select those champions and work in a project? And then there is one more related question to that. Imelda Abano from Philippines, our colleague, and a journalist from Philippines. She has a question, and she is saying, in your program, how important social and gender transformative climate smart agriculture strategies and mechanisms are in empowering women farmers? So if you can link those two questions, Leo, that would be great. And then we can go to the other questions.
Yes, first on the emission, the main sources of emission in Southeast Asia are rice cultivation, and the other one is land use change, especially the deforestation coming from the deforestation, especially in Indonesia, the forest burning there in Kalimantan. Those are the main sources of emission in Southeast Asia, and especially the land use change in Indonesia. Now in Vietnam, it's in rice cultivation. On the first question, well, about the how do we identify the champions in the climate smart villages or in the target communities? What we usually do is we work with the local leadership, the existing leadership or organization in the communities. We do not try to bypass this organization or the structure of the community, but we work with them, and from there we try to identify those entrepreneurs or key informants or key leaders in the community, or we also try to work with emerging entrepreneurs who are interested in new approaches. So that's how we do this stage. We do not try to establish or impose a new organization because that is not sustainable. On the issue of gender and social inclusion, we usually put a lot of weight about on this issue because as you may see in Southeast Asia, women have a very big role. And in agriculture, most of the activities in agriculture are actually done now by women. But this also varies in different countries. So, for example, if you are talking of Laos, when we tried to look at the structure of many communities, actually the men are all migrated to Thailand, and it's the women who are left in the farm. So they do most of the activities. So with this kind of structure, we try to see what is the implication of the climate smart technologies that we are promoting on their work. So, for example, we found out that if you introduce climate smart varieties, for example, drought tolerant or salt tolerant in the Mekong Delta, it is the women who do most of the replanting. So if you go around Vietnam, you will see women replanting rice. But if you introduce salt tolerant varieties or drought tolerant varieties, this reduces the burden on women doing the replanting. So these are the things that we try to see. In our work on climate information services, for example, in Laos again, and northern Vietnam, and in Cambodia, we deal a lot with women because usually it's the women who keep a lot of information about what is going to be done in the farm. And you may be surprised that sometimes it's the women who will tell the men what to do when it comes to specific information. So we work, for example, in the climate information service that we are doing in the 3 countries, the entry point that we use are the women's savings and loan associations in the community. So we use those women's group, and they are the ones who process the information and communicate it with their husband so that it will be applied in the field. So the role of women actually is very important in many parts of Southeast Asia, and especially when it comes to coping to climate change impact. In the Philippines, it's a different case. That's why we say that in different countries, you will have different way of treating it. The Philippines, very often the women are the one who move out of the farm and go to the city to look for work. So in this case, you have also to look at how you try to deal with the men who are left to tend to the farms or do most of the activities. So different countries have different situation when it comes to this matter.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Leo. Can I ask anyone if you want to ask questions? Please unmute your mic and you can ask questions. Just when you ask questions to our panelists, please shortly introduce yourself, where you work, and where are you from. Anyone interested to ask questions, please? They're silent. There are more questions in the text. Maybe I know there are a few other questions that we were asked in this question and answer text box. Actually, there is one Huawei Y6 Prime 2018. The name was like away from Nepal, but you know it is. I mean, it is showing up Huawei Y6 Prime 2018, and he said, "Oh, sorry for the username." But he has a same question as well. He says, migration is a problem in many countries in Asia. So how do these climate smart policies be adapted to address this kind of challenges when you talk about agriculture sector, right? So can you a bit more elaborate on how this migration issue can be adapted in the climate smart agriculture in the countries in Asia, especially he's talking about Nepal.
Right. So yeah, exactly. He was mentioning Nepal. So I think obviously the idea behind climate smart agriculture, as mentioned before, is to on one hand improve productivity in the sector and increase resilience, so that farmers can adapt better to the impacts of climate change. So if climate change, and I believe this is the case and will increasingly be the case, is a driver of migration, because farmers don't earn enough anymore from their farm because of or partially related to climate change impacts, then having CSA might reduce the incentive to migrate, because they become more productive, more resilient, and they might have less of an incentive to look for a job somewhere else. Now, I think we also have to be a bit realistic, because the drivers of migrations are not only, let's say, a lower productivity in the agriculture sector. There are many other reasons why globally people move to cities, for instance, right? Because there is better infrastructure, because better access to health, to education, and so on. So that will not be tackled by CSA per se. So if we want to mitigate the drivers of migration, then I think a lot more needs to be done. On one hand, helping farmers to be more resilient, but on the other hand, also providing the infrastructure and services that people want to have also in rural areas.
In the same question, there is one question from Kedar Kulkarni. So he says, can you be more specific about the climate smart technologies used and the crop varieties used to deal with climate hazard? Can you be more specific on those technology and the crop varieties, if it is possible?
Yeah, in the example that I showed a while ago, that is focused on rice production in the Mekong Delta. Now, this involves the planting of saline-tolerant varieties. So, and the other one is when it is flooding, it's flood-tolerant varieties, and during the drought, it's the drought-tolerant varieties. So what we are saying here is that the practice of climate smart technologies, or the application of climate smart technologies and practices, they have to be very location specific, because they may be climate smart in one place but not in other places. And at the same time, they have to be risk specific. So what is the risk that you're addressing? So that's why what we did is we made a climate risk maps for salinity, and then we work with the local communities or the local authorities to identify what is the best variety, saline tolerant varieties that can be applied or that can be planted in those areas. So it has to be very specific. We cannot prescribe a specific practice for everybody, or we cannot just tell farmers that you should apply this technology, because it may not work in their place. You have to match the risk, the climate risk, and the technology, and then you have to work backward so that before they come to know the risk, or when the risk is about to occur, you are ready with the seeds. If it is seed, you are ready with the training, if it is training that is needed. So application of climate smart technologies and practices is not just like the normal extension work that we do. There's a lot of planning and integration that you have to do before a technology or practice can be applied. Because as I've said, there is a risk that you have to forecast when it will happen, because it's not happening. Even flooding does not occur every year. In many places, it occurs only at certain time of the year. And sometimes the flooding may not be severe. It can only be a normal flooding. So, and then the same is true with the others, salinity intrusion or drought. So you have to link early warning with preparation, and then the application of the technologies and practices.
Yeah, just in addition to that question, it is another question that also talks about the alternative crops. So Meera Rajagopalan from Impact Magazine has two questions. One is, do alternative crops apart from rice or wheat find a place in climate smart agriculture? If
Yes.
so, can you give examples? And the second is, with such a large focus on climate smart agriculture, on the specific conditions of the regions, how might you go about working in larger areas like South Asia or Africa at a scale? So how difficult it is actually, so please.
Yes, the example that I cited actually, once you have been able to identify the risks and the areas that are affected, then you can also decide whether you will still plant rice or you try to do other crops. Because you see, there is a risk that it may just like what I was showing a while ago, there are areas that are red. So if you are in the red area, rice is really dangerous in that area. If you plant rice, it's very risky. So you might as well look up for other crops rather than rice. You can go to aquaculture. For example, in the Mekong Delta, the areas that are high salinity, it might be better for them to just move to aquaculture rather than persist on planting rice. So this is why when you are able to identify the risk, you can also decide with the different stakeholders on what measure you will do. And the measures that you can do is you can adjust your planting, you can change your variety, you can change your crop, or you can do other options. So that is how it should be. Now, regarding the scale, I think we really have to attain scale when applying climate smart technologies and practices. That's why in the Mekong Delta, we targeted that's about 4 million hectares. That's big. If you are talking of 4 million hectares of rice land, 13 provinces. So that is how it should be applied. Not just you start from a climate smart village, a small village, but you have to spread to a landscape so that you can see the benefit of adaptation, and you can also see the benefit of mitigation. You cannot just do it in small application, because it will not work. You have to work with communities to adapt. You have to work with provinces or districts to adapt. The same is true when you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emission. You have to work with landscapes.
Yes.
Godfrey, just one more question to you, and then you can respond that as well with that remaining from Leo. So do any countries, specifically there's a question from Chandrakant Pandit from Nepal. So he says, do any South Asian countries have formulated the policies on climate smart traditional crops or agriculture, or are there any other countries who have been implementing this kind of policies on climate smart agriculture?
Yeah, so there are definitely a lot of initiatives, and a lot of governments in South Asia, also in Southeast Asia, are working on CSA, climate smart agriculture strategies. So, for instance, now we're working in Bangladesh together with the World Bank and the government, and we're helping them develop a CSA investment plan. So we went together with partners through a prioritization process, a sort of planning process to try to understand which technologies should be scaled, and try to also understand what would be the impacts of scaling those technologies in terms of food security, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, water use. So we're doing that in Bangladesh, but also in many other countries in the region. In the Philippines, they prefer the term climate resilient agriculture, but essentially it's very similar to climate smart agriculture. And there is a lot of work that is also done by the government. They have a program actually specifically dedicated to adaptation and mitigation in agriculture. And we work a lot with them and help them providing sort of tools, methodologies, and robustness in terms of analysis to be able to design these plans related to CSA or climate resilient agriculture. So definitely there are a lot of things moving. Also here in Vietnam, there has been a lot of discussions on CSA because the country, as part of their NDC, so as part of the commitment under the Paris Agreement, have specific targets for the agriculture sector where they also foresee the scaling of CSA technologies. I just would like to add a bit more. There was this question about examples of, or concrete examples on what CSA is. And I think it's worth just mentioning, I don't want to pick winner, right? And just mentioning sort of concrete example of what is being done. So rice, for instance, is, as you all know, is a key commodity here in the region. And one very popular technology that has been actually supported by IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, is AWD, so alternate wetting and drying. So what the idea there is basically to let normally rice is kept flooded, and there with this new technology you basically manage water level and you dry the field from time to time, and that the impact of this technology is really very important reduction in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and also in water use. I think greenhouse gas emission, what is it, 40, it can be up to 40% or
from up to 70%.
Up to 7, so even more than, so really massive reduction in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, really important reduction in terms of water use, just by this relatively actually simple technology. Another technology that is often discussed is agroforestry. So putting trees on farmland and which can have impacts in terms of for instance, here in Vietnam, you had a lot of monocropping, coffee monocropping, and now they are putting more shade trees, like durian trees, avocado trees, and that can help actually make the coffee production more resilient because of the shade that they provide, but also it diversifies income for farmers, so they're less dependent on just one crop, but they have revenues from different crops, which can help them better manage climate variability and so on. So and then in terms of carbon stock, it has a small but positive impact because those trees might sequester carbon and more than what you have normally in the coffee trees. So I mean, those are just, as I said, I don't want to say those are the two winners, so but in terms of CSA, but I want to say those are like important or practices that come up quite often for key commodities here in the region.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, those are very helpful. There are many questions on our Q&A text box. Is there anyone in the platform to ask questions verbally, or I should go with the questions that you have sent us on the text? Anyone want to speak to us? If you want to speak, open your mic, unmute your mic, and you can ask questions by yourself. If not, then I will go for other questions. Anyone in the forum, please? Okay. If there is anyone, I can again come back. So let's go with the questions that were sent. So there is one question by anonymous attendee. I don't know the name. Actually, it came as anonymous attendee. But the question is, how do you change the narrative when you work with the farmers and communities to understand climate smart agriculture better? Because when you say smart, people think that so much only technology, or it is so hi-fi technology that you can't even work with it. You need more and more investments. So how do you change those kind of narratives and make it more simple and easy?
First of all, in Southeast Asia and also in South Asia, the way climate smart agriculture is translated in the local language also is different. So in some countries, they don't use the word smart. And even in some countries, when you translate when you translate it to the local dialect, it means another thing. So, for example, in Philippines, they don't use climate smart agriculture; they use climate resilient agriculture. So CRA. So in Vietnam, when you translate climate smart agriculture, it basically means of an agroecologically sound agriculture. So it doesn't always sound as high tech as you may say smart, because when you deal with farmer, you also have to translate it to a language that is clear to them, where you can have a good communication. So maybe in Nepal, I don't know how you translate it, climate smart, or you call it also climate smart agriculture. But as we work with the farmers, we usually do not start with technologies that are high tech. We also work with technologies that are nearest to them and evaluate how these technologies can help them cope with the different climate threats that they are facing in their communities. So it's not always high tech as we may be thinking.
Cool. So it is about how to use those available technologies or resources around you in a better way, and also add more wherever possible, right? So there's one more question from Himanshu Pathak, possible from India. So the question is, can the large-scale adoption of CSA is feasible in agriculture in India? I think part of this question was answered, but he also says the characteristics of these small plots, inadequate adoption of new seed varieties and technologies, and the most important thing is lack of access to formal credit by the majority of small farmers. So how do you, what do you think, in other words, can this climate smart agriculture prove to be a panacea for the ailing Indian agricultural sector? What do you think?
Actually, the climate smart agriculture approaches, including insurance, credit, and all these things, are actually revolutionizing the way we deal with these things like credit and insurance. So, for example, in insurance, we used to have this production or yield-based damage. So farmers, if they are hit by a certain calamity, somebody will go to their field and assess the damage. So now with the concept of climate smart agriculture, climate smartness, we are using now other ways to measure damage and give payouts in insurance. So in India, they are one of the biggest implementer now of the index-based climate insurance. So rather than waiting for the farmers to harvest and assessing the damage, there are now triggers that will allow payouts. So the same, I think, with credit later on, because one of the things that makes farmer very difficult to pay is when they suffer calamities or damages in their field. But if you link this with your insurance and it is based on index or remote sensing or other measures, it doesn't require a very long time or very long period to assess before they can be considered as receiving payout in insurance or receiving some cancellation of death or something. So it's revolutionizing the way we implement this credit and insurance. So in the future, we will see that it may be easier for farmers to avail of credit and still be able to pay or cancel their debt because of calamities or because of some things that may happen in their field. So things are changing. Hopefully, it's for the best.
There's one more question, and the question is, we are talking more about increasing the productivity, right? But when you say increasing productivity, it also demands a lot of the pesticides and other kind of chemicals to be used. So do you have any examples where you have tried to use more organic agriculture and use it more smartly and overcome those kind of problems that comes in the chemical world when you talk about increasing the yield or productivity? That question may be asked by, let me check, but there's one question about that. Oh yeah, Kedar Kulkarni is the one who asked that question too.
So climate smart agriculture is not just about productivity. It's about increasing resilience to climate impact and also improving productivity. And at the same time, you have to also contribute to sustainability, means a reduction of greenhouse gas emission or green development. Now, those are the three outcomes that usually we try to meet when we talk about climate smart agriculture. So it doesn't always mean that you will have to use more pesticide. Actually, when you look at it, you want to reduce your greenhouse gas emission, you actually have to make use of your fertilizer in a more efficient way, because nitrogen contributes a emission that is even more dangerous than methane emission from rice field. So it's higher when it comes to contribution to greenhouse gas, the nitrous oxide. So in climate smart agriculture, you have to use the nutrient more efficiently. Not you have to use more. No, you have to use it more efficiently so you contribute to a sustainable agriculture and also to a sustainable growth and reduce greenhouse gas emission, reduce your cost, increase your productivity. Something it is like that. It's a balance. That's why in climate smart agriculture, for example, in Vietnam, they are also using the so-called SRI. So that is also one of the practices that is recommended. And SRI, as we all know, which is the sustainable rice intensification. This is a low input type of agriculture. It's basically using organic, but in Vietnam they have adapted it to combine organic and inorganic fertilization in rice field. And it also helps them save water. They save water, and at the same time, they also contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emission because they basically apply alternate wetting and drying. So climate smart agriculture is not about using more inputs. It's increasing productivity, increasing resilience, and increasing sustainability in agriculture.
Yeah, just one point on this, just coming back to the Global Synthesis report on CSA that we launched at COP last year together with the World Bank, and that I mentioned just earlier in my presentation. So about 50% of all the practice, I said that about 50% of all the practices that have been prioritized by experts globally for CSA, so CSA practices, fall into 5 categories: water management, intercropping, organic input, conservation agriculture, and crop tolerance to stress. And a lot of these, especially intercropping, organic input, of course, and conservation in agriculture, are about actually reducing input use and fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer. So definitely, as Leo said, it's really about increasing sustainably the productivity of the agriculture sector.
Yeah, so we have 5 more minutes, and there's a tough question that you guys need to answer now, because it is about journalism. So a lot of people who are here participating are journalists, and the question that they would like to pose is, how do you think journalists can best report on the climate change, adaptation, and agriculture issues where the stories are actually? So, I mean, being specific, would you please tell our participants where the stories lies?
Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
no, well, where the stories lies, where the story lies. That's a good question, and we can definitely, if they come back to us, try to think about like sites that are interesting to visit. I wouldn't have like now on the top of my mind, like the one site that I would say everyone needs to go to. But definitely through the climate smart villages, through the different work I've been doing in the region, it's easy for us to identify interesting sites to visit. I personally, I mean, I'm not a journalist, but my opinion is that actually telling, a lot of discussions on climate change is around the scientific reports and so on, which are important for decision makers. But for the person in the street, I think it's interesting to also know to have actual stories of people and report about these. So I think really, like telling about farmer X or Y in a specific region and the new reality they are facing could be quite interesting to make the impacts more, stuff tangible for people. And but that's, as I said, I'm not a journalist, but just maybe an idea.
I think, I think the journalists should be more critical of the measures that countries are adapting when it comes to climate change, because very often we are impressed with just technologies and practices. But as I have been emphasizing, if the technologies and practices are not positioned properly to address a specific climate risk, and at the same time they are not prepared beforehand to be ready to address that challenge, they are not also very helpful. So it's not enough to be writing about salt-tolerant rice varieties, plant-tolerant varieties, or whatever technologies that you're talking about, but they should be more critical in looking at it in a more holistic way. How are the policies, the programs integrating these different practices so that they will be applied in scale if the threat happens? And this always occurs every time nowadays. For example, there is a forecast of El Nino in this year, and we see many journalists writing about varieties that can help farmers to cope with El Nino, but it's too late. They should try to write about these things when El Nino is still maybe 6 months before that, so that governments and farmers become aware and they will be ready to apply these technologies, these adaptive measures. So I think we should have more critical writers when it comes to environment or adaptation measures that they will be writing about. Otherwise, it's too late. If you write about El Nino measures at this time, it's already occurring, and the farmer cannot do anything, and the governments cannot do anything.
Thank you. We are really out of time now. We have 1 more minute now, so there were a lot of other questions too. We will definitely continue to do this kind of the webinars in the future as well. Thank you so much for this session, Leo and Godfrey, and also our participants all over the Asia. If you want to be in touch with us, we can definitely share our email. So I'll just send an email to all participants in the text box, and you can write to me, and I can link you to Godfrey and Leo whenever needed. It was wonderful discussion. Thank you all for participation. A lot of good questions and good answers too, and we will continue to do it in the future. Thank you very much, and we are really on time, and we would like to wrap up this session. And thanking you all, and we will definitely keep in touch with you again. So my email address, I have just written my email address on the text box. Please feel free to copy and write to me.
Thank you very much, and feel free to send us, drop us an email whenever you have additional questions. So I think if Ramesh, you can share with everyone our email address, or we can put it in the chat here.
Or you can do that.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.